now with more on our top story. The ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinians appears to be holding. Hamas is claiming victory, and there are reports that this is infuriating Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas.
To discuss all this, let's bring in J.J. Goldberg, editor-at-large at the Forward, a bi-monthly American magazine published for a Jewish-American audience. And J.J., explain why Mahmoud Abbas and his organization, which controls the West Bank, would be envious or jealous of Hamas claiming victory from Gaza.
Well, it's not exactly envious or jealous. He views himself as the legitimate leader of the Palestinians. Gaza is supposed to be part of his territory. Hamas has been negotiating with him for a couple of years now, and they haven't reached an agreement. But for Israel and Egypt to reach a formal agreement with Hamas ratifies Hamas as the authority, and it undermines his position as the leader of the Palestinian entity. So he's got a problem with it.
So let's get it straight. For Israel's interests, it's better for them to have a strong Abbas or a weakened Hamas?
Depends on what you consider Israel's interests to be. If you don't want a Palestinian state, if you want to keep them separated, strengthen Hamas, and that way they can't reach an agreement and you remain in charge.
You need the rift if you're in the Israeli right-wing government.
Right, right. It's interesting that the military, when the cabinet voted yesterday to accept a ceasefire, it was at the urging of the military. Because they see, Hamas a year ago adopted a new constitution which accepts the 67 borders in a Palestinian state. It says we're against it, but that's the Palestinian national consensus. So from a very long point of view, you can see letting Hamas settle in and letting the negotiations with Abbas continue in order to have a negotiating partner. One of the messages of this ceasefire, is that there is somebody to negotiate with. There is a partner.
In other words, the peace deal that everyone keeps talking about that may be coming from Donald Trump, it won't be simply Israelis and Palestinians sitting down. It'll be Israelis negotiating with Hamas and Israelis negotiating with Abbas in the West Bank.
Well, Israel's position is you can't really negotiate a deal with Abbas until he's in charge of Gaza. But you can't negotiate with him if he's bringing in Hamas because they're destructionist terrorists. So they haven't made up their minds. And Netanyahu's position, as your previous package said, of being stuck between these two Israels, it sort of symbolizes the problem of wanting to move forward with an agreement, but not being able to decide what the relationship of Hamas to the larger Palestinian entity should be.
So, JJ, today, Hamas and Hezbollah-related media outlets, their headlines read, Gaza topples Lieberman, Gaza overthrows the Minister of War, Lieberman. Was this round of escalation a clear victory for Hamas?
I think they're being a little silly, but that's what we expect of them. Lieberman resigned because he wanted more power, more force, not less. So it's not like they fought him to a standstill. The government decided to stop because it was able to get what it wanted. And remember, it's a small group of ministers who objected. The cabinet is mostly united, and the opposition is more liberal than the cabinet. But Lieberman, besides wanting to position himself for the next elections as an independent force, he wanted more force, not less. He wasn't forced to back down. He was forced by the Israeli government to back down because they had to deal with Hamas.
J.J. Goldberg, editor-at-large for The Forward. J.J., thank you. Good to have you here.
Good to be here.
Here in the U.S., the government is stepping up a financial war aimed at Middle East terrorists and their sponsors.
That's right. There are new U.S. rewards for tips leading to the capture of terrorists. And these rewards are focused on Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. Our senior Washington correspondent, Dan Raviv, has the story.
In the wake of this week's violence on Israel's border with Gaza, the Trump administration put out a new offer of $5 million for information leading to the capture of a senior man in Hamas, Salih al-Aruri, one of the founders of the group's military wing. According to U.S. officials, he lives in Lebanon working with Iran's Revolutionary Guards. He's now at the center of wanted posters issued by the U.S. in several languages. And on the left is Khalil Harb, also also in Lebanon, a senior advisor to the head of Hezbollah. He also works with Iran and is a liaison to Palestinian militant groups. There's also a $5 million reward now for the man depicted on the right, Haytham Tabatabai, who's been a Hezbollah commander in combat in Syria and in Yemen, added now to a list of SDGTs, specially designated global terrorists. The U.S. keeps mentioning Iran's role, now charging that government spends almost $1 billion a year supporting terrorist groups, 70% of that to Hezbollah. The State Department's counterterrorism coordinator, Nathan Sales, told the Washington Institute for Near East Policy,
"We expect, indeed we insist, that Iran follow the same rules as every other country and end its use of terrorism as a tool of statecraft. We will make clear to Iran-backed terrorists and their masters in Tehran that there are costs, increasingly heavy ones, to their support for terrorist barbarism. We are prepared to impose those costs on the regime and its proxies wherever they may be."
The law that established the State Department's Rewards for Justice program specified in the 1980s that the targets would be terrorists who are out to kill Americans. But the focus on these three men and on Iran demonstrates that in the Trump administration's view, the sworn enemies of Israel are also enemies of the United States. Dan Raviv, I-24 News, Washington.
Meanwhile, Jordan's King Abdullah was in D.C. today to receive the Templeton Prize. It's given to individuals who have made exceptional contributions to global spiritual understanding.
The king was recognized in part for honoring Jordan's historic role as custodian of the holiest sites in Jerusalem. I-24 News senior diplomatic correspondent Nina Larson was there for the ceremony.
This year's Templeton Prize recipient is King Abdullah of Jordan.
Everything you honor me for simply carries onward what Jordanians have always done and how Jordanians have always lived in mutual kindness, harmony, and brotherhood.
UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres praised not only the king's interfaith work, but Jordan's role as host to millions of refugees fleeing conflict.
Not to mention the millions of Palestine refugees. Jordan has received about 1 million of Syrian refugees and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi refugees, with a generosity that should be referred today in a world where, unfortunately, refugees are so many times forgotten.
But perhaps the king's most challenging spiritual role, overseeing the holy sites in the world's most contested city, Jerusalem, where three faiths believe is the point where heaven meets the earth and is the scene of miracles.
More than half of the world's people belong to religions that hold Jerusalem as a holy city: Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. And a special duty binds me and all Jordanians as Hashemite custodian of Jerusalem's Islamic and Christian holy sites. With its long multi-faith heritage, Jerusalem must be protected as a unifying city of peace.
The Hashemite custodial legacy has been forged by birthright, world wars, and modern politics. Since King Abdullah I held East Jerusalem in 1948, Jordan has dedicated $1 billion to preserve and guard Al-Aqsa, the Dome of the Rock, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. King Hussein watched over the dome in the 60s, then still part of Jordanian East Jerusalem, and ensured Jordan's role was enshrined in the 1994 peace treaty with Israel. King Abdullah has continued his father's charge, donating over $1 million to the Jerusalem Waqf, and financed the painstaking renovation of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, thought to be the final resting place of Christ. The king has long promoted peace within Islam.
The greater jihad has nothing to do with the hate-filled fiction promoted by the Khawarij, the outlaws of Islam, such as Daesh and the like, or the Islamophobes, who also distort our religion.
Launching the United Nations Interfaith Week and commissioning a song by Middle East superstar Sami Youssef. The Hashemite sacred role is as timeless as faith itself. But King Abdullah has introduced modern pragmatism, calling for common ground, not conflict, in shared belief. Lena Larson, I-24 News, Washington.
Well, it's even more remarkable. I mean, the piece got into the fact that he's in such a tough position, and he's been in that tough position between so many competing forces for so long. His ability to transcend it, I think, makes him one of the most intriguing figures in the entire Middle East.
That's very right. Despite hostilities and pressure from Israel's Arab neighbors, something about Israel's relationship with Jordan has always been something remarkable. And despite they were fighting a couple wars between them, it has sustained.
Yeah, remarkable.
It appears the UK and the European Union are one step closer to Brexit. There is a temporary draft deal in place approved by Prime Minister Theresa May's cabinet.
To discuss all of this, and including some of the steps that still need to be done before the March deadline for the split, we are joined by our UK and European correspondent, Jonathan Sarchidoti. And Jonathan, fair to say that Prime Minister May, she cleared a hurdle today, but describe some of the other hurdles that still remain.
Well, David, this hasn't been an easy day for Theresa May, but she's been constantly carrying out this balancing act. And if it's difficult for her, it's even more difficult perhaps for viewers to keep tabs on all of those things that make Brexit really very confusing. There's been Brexit means Brexit, talk of Canada plus deals, a no-deal Brexit, the Irish border backstop, another people's vote, otherwise known as another referendum, legal challenges to Brexit, publishing or not publishing the legal advice of the Attorney General, a split in her own cabinet, splits in her own party, splits in other parties, splits in the government, splits in Parliament at large, and a government without a clear majority. All of this, of course, means that Theresa May has had an impossible task in trying to come up with a draft that she can sell not only to her own cabinet, but to Parliament in a meaningful vote that she's promised them, and to the British people, as well as satisfying all the needs of the EU. Today, she said, she has a draft agreement with the EU that they can then take to the 27 other EU nations, and that can then be put to Parliament. So she's certainly not home and dry, but this is an important step.
And Jonathan, the most contentious part of the Brexit deal is the Irish border. What has been agreed upon?
Well, in relation to the Northern Irish backstop, as it's called, there's another catch-22. The two sides have agreed that they hope not to need to use the so-called backstop agreement in order to keep the border between the two countries other than being a hard border. They say that they will make a unified customs union between Great Britain, including Northern Ireland, and the EU, and that will carry on for a fixed period of 2 years until there can be a proper trade agreement made. Hopefully, though, they won't need to put that in place because during the transition period of 2 years, they will have come up with a deal that would supersede it. Not many people think that will happen. It took Canada, for example, 7 years to make a deal with the EU. Great Britain, of course, has some other complications to deal with, bearing in mind it has been part of the EU. So many people aren't happy with what she's done here, saying that she's capitulated in making this arrangement with the EU.
And Jonathan, real quickly, in the last 20 seconds we have left, what's the next deadline for all of this?
Well, Theresa May is going to make a statement tomorrow, and then the EU will have a summit of the 27 other leaders in order to try and agree or not agree with the position, and then a parliamentary vote perhaps before Christmas. UK
and European correspondent Jonathan Sarchidoti. Jonathan, thank you.
Coming up here on Crossroads, a live report from California, the latest on the historic wildfires ravaging both ends of the states, and the death toll continues to climb. And amidst a staffing shakeup at the White House, First Lady Melania Trump has taken aim at a top administration national security official, a security official she's never even met. We'll have that story ahead when Crossroads on I-24 News continues.